"Which one?" the matchmaker asked, her quill poised above the ledger. He did not look at the 10 portraits arranged before him on the desk. He did not glance at the lineage charts, the dowry figures, the miniatures painted by the finest artists in London. He looked past all of it, past the silk and the titles and the carefully curated perfection, and said in a voice that made the candle flames tremble, "None of them." Mrs. Helena Whitfield's hand went still. In 30 years of matchmaking, she had brokered unions between some of the most powerful families in England. She had never, not once, had a client reject every candidate she presented. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "You understand perfectly." His eyes were the color of a winter storm, gray, cold, missing nothing. "There is always one. The one the family hides. The one they are ashamed of. The one they did not think worth presenting. Give me her." The silence that followed was extraordinary. "Your Grace, Every family has one Mrs. Whitfield." He leaned forward, and the candlelight caught the sharp angles of his face and turned them into blades. "The daughter who is too plain, too old, too quiet, too strange. The one who has been measured against her sisters and found wanting. The one they have given up on. I want her." "But why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. One did not ask a duke why. One simply did as he wished and sent the bill. Lord Sebastian Thorne, the 7th Duke of Blackmore, looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, and somehow that made it more dangerous. "Because a woman the world has thrown away will understand what it means to be claimed. And I will know with absolute certainty that when she looks at me, she sees me. Not the title, not the fortune, not the power. Me. Now, welcome back to Aristocratic Heart, my friends. I have missed you. Before we begin the story, tell me where you are listening from. City, country, time zone. I want to know. Knowing you are out there, listening alongside me, makes this feel like something special. Tonight's story takes place in the autumn of 1843, during what they called the Little Season, that quieter, darker gathering of London society between September and November, when families returned from their country estates, and the marriage market reopened with renewed desperation. It is a story about a woman who had been systematically erased by the people who should have loved her most, and the Duke who spent 4 years searching for her, building her a world, before he ever spoke her name. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the Ashford family. The Ashford family occupied a townhouse on Curzon Street during the season. Not the most fashionable address, but respectable enough that Lady Margaret Ashford could claim proximity to Mayfair without the expense of actually achieving it. Sir Thomas Ashford was a baronet of modest means, £1 for 100 a year from a small estate in Kent, and even more modest ambition. He was a man who had spent his life quietly managing his land and regarding the chaos of London with the weary resignation of a man who knew he had lost the war long before the first battle. His wife, however, had ambitions enough for both of them. Lady Margaret had been beautiful once, and she had never quite forgiven the world for allowing that beauty to fade. What remained was sharp cheekbones, sharp tongue, sharp eyes that could calculate a man's income to the nearest pound from across a ballroom. She had given Sir Thomas 3 daughters. 2 of them, she believed, were investments. The third was an expense she could no longer afford. Rosalind was 22, golden-haired and graceful, with a kind of practiced elegance that could make a man feel as though he were the only person in the room. Arabella was 19, dark-haired and accomplished, with a talent for the harp that her mother deployed like artillery at every social gathering. They were, in Lady Margaret's estimation, her best hope of climbing the social ladder she had spent her entire married life clinging to. And then there was Josephine. Josephine was 25. She had her father's quiet gray eyes and her mother's angular features. But where those features combined in Lady Margaret to create something striking, in Josephine they produced something that polite society could only describe as interesting. She was not ugly. She was worse. She was unremarkable. In a world that demanded women be either beautiful or invisible, Josephine had been assigned the latter category before she had ever been given the chance to prove otherwise. Sir Thomas's income of £1,400 a year was respectable but not generous, and the cost of launching 3 daughters into society was ruinous. Choices had to be made. Lady Margaret had made hers. Rosalind and Arabella would attend every ball, every dinner, every soiree the season offered. They would wear the new gowns. They would ride in the carriage. They would be seen. Josephine would stay home. Not officially, of course. Officially, Josephine suffered from delicate health, mysterious ailments that required rest and quiet. This was the story Lady Margaret told anyone who inquired. And very few people inquired, because very few people remembered that the Ashford family had 3 daughters instead of 2. In truth, Josephine's health was perfectly sound. What was unsound was her wardrobe, 4 seasons old, in colors chosen to make her fade into whatever background she was placed against. What was unsound was her hope, which had died so quietly she had not noticed its passing. On this particular evening, Josephine sat alone in the upstairs drawing room with a volume of Byron, while her mother and sisters prepared for the Duchess of Pembroke's ball downstairs. She could hear them through the floorboards. Rosalind's bright laughter, Arabella's scales on the harp, Lady Margaret's voice issuing commands like a general marshalling troops. The house smelled of rosewater and ironing starch and the particular desperation that accompanied every evening of the little season. Josephine turned a page. She had read this particular poem so many times that the words had become less language and more texture, a familiar roughness beneath her fingers, a rhythm that matched her breathing. She did not feel sorry for herself. Self-pity required the belief that things could be different, and Josephine had surrendered that belief 3 seasons ago, when she had attended her first and only ball and spent the entire evening standing against the wall, watching other women dance, feeling herself becoming more transparent with every passing hour. She was 25, unmarried, unremarkable, and she had made her peace with it. Or so she told herself on evenings like this, when the house emptied around her and the silence settled like dust. Now, it is important to understand something about the little season of 1843. This was not merely a calendar of parties. It was an economic engine of staggering proportions, a marketplace where human beings were the commodities and dowries were the currency. For a family like the Ashfords, with £1,400 a year and 3 daughters, the mathematics were brutal. Every gown was a gamble. Every ball was an investment. And every daughter who failed to secure an offer was a loss that compounded with interest, season after season, until the family's resources were exhausted and the daughter in question was quietly reclassified from eligible to surplus. Josephine was surplus. She did not know, could not possibly have known, that at this very moment, in a study lined with mahogany and the quiet violence of old money, a man who had been searching for her for 4 years was about to find her at last. His name was Sebastian Thorne, and he was the 7th Duke of Blackmore. To say that Sebastian Thorne was powerful would be like saying the Thames was damp. He was 36 years old, possessed of £38,000 a year for estates, a seat in the House of Lords, and a reputation that made mothers clutch their daughters closer and fathers reach for their brandy. He was not handsome in the way society understood the word. Not golden, not charming, not warm. He was something else entirely, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same stone as his ancestral home, and eyes the color of a winter storm. Cold, clear, missing nothing. He had been the most eligible bachelor in England for 14 years, and in that time he had declined every woman who had been presented to him. Not rudely. Sebastian Thorne was never rude. Rudeness implied emotion, and emotion was a luxury he did not permit himself in public. He simply looked, assessed, and moved on, with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he wanted, and had not yet found it. Until now. Now I need to pause here and tell you something the Duke did not tell Mrs. Whitfield. Because Sebastian Thorne was not a man who shared his reasons with anyone, and this particular reason was one he had guarded for 4 years. 4 years earlier, at Lord Harrington's autumn house party in Hampshire, Sebastian had seen a woman he could not forget. She was sitting alone in the conservatory, tucked into a corner beside a potted lemon tree, reading while the rest of the guests paraded through the gardens in their social performances. She wore a dress the color of pale amber, almost brown, almost gold, and she was so absorbed in her book that she did not notice when a gust of wind from the open door lifted the pages from her lap and scattered them across the tiled floor. He watched her chase those pages with a laugh so unguarded, so utterly lacking in the self-consciousness that infected every other person at that party, that something in his chest had shifted like a key turning in a lock. She was laughing. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her hands were stained with ink. And she was completely, beautifully alive in a way that no one else in that carefully orchestrated gathering had been. And then she was gone. He had turned to ask Lord Harrington's wife who the young woman was, the one reading in the conservatory with ink on her fingers. And when he turned back, she had vanished. Slipped away like smoke, like a half-remembered dream. He inquired discreetly, carefully, through channels that would not invite gossip. But no one at Lord Harrington's house party could identify a young woman reading alone in the conservatory. She had been so thoroughly invisible that she had left no trace. He did not know her name. He did not know her family. He had only her face, angular, intelligent, alive in a way that no other face had ever been, and a single glimpse of the book she had been reading. Byron. She had been reading Byron. For 4 years he searched. He attended events he despised, scanning crowds for that face. He collected books, Byron first, then Shelley, then Keats, building a library for a woman whose name he did not know, on the faith that he would find her, and that when he did, he would want her to have everything. It was obsessive. It was irrational. It was the only real thing he had felt in 14 years of being the Duke of Blackmore. When he hired Mrs. Whitfield, it was not, as she believed, because he had finally decided to marry. It was his last, most desperate strategy. The woman he had seen had been invisible at a society event, overlooked, unaccompanied, unremarked upon. If she was the kind of woman families hid, then a matchmaker who specialized in knowing every family's secrets would be his best chance of finding her. Mrs. Whitfield swallowed. "I shall make inquiries, Your Grace. You have 3 days." She found 3 families willing to acknowledge their hidden daughters. The Duke of Blackmore rejected the first 2, a widow's daughter from Cornwall, and a baronet's eldest who had been sent to live with an aunt in Scotland. Neither face matched the one in his memory. The third file was Miss Josephine Ashford, age 25, of Curzon Street. The daughter Lady Margaret had not thought worth mentioning. Mrs. Whitfield had included a brief physical description, as was her practice. Gray eyes, angular features, tall for a woman, of a quiet disposition. Sebastian's hand stopped on the page. "This one," he said. "Does she read?" Mrs. Whitfield blinked. I could not say, Your Grace. Her family mentioned no particular accomplishments." "Find out if she reads Byron." The inquiry, made through a discreet conversation with an Ashford household servant, confirmed what Sebastian already knew. Miss Josephine Ashford read voraciously. Byron was her favorite. Sebastian said, and his voice carried the weight of 4 years of silence, finally breaking. "Send the invitation." "The invitation, Your Grace?" "The Duchess of Pembroke's ball. Ensure that Miss Ashford attends." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. "And Mrs. Whitfield, ensure that she does not know I asked for her. I want to see who she is when she believes no one is watching. I need to be certain." The invitation arrived at Curzon Street on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by a footman in the Pembroke livery. It was addressed, impossibly inexplicably, to Miss Josephine Ashford. Lady Margaret opened it, as she opened all correspondence in the household, and her face underwent a series of transformations that would have been comical if they were not so revealing. Confusion, suspicion, calculation, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Because one did not refuse an invitation from the Duchess of Pembroke without consequences that even Lady Margaret could not afford. "You will attend," she told Josephine, as though bestowing a punishment rather than a privilege. "I cannot imagine why they have included you, but you will attend, and you will not embarrass this family." Josephine looked at the invitation. Her name was written in elegant script, and for a moment she could not process the reality of it. Her name, on an invitation to a ball she had been told she would never attend. "I have nothing to wear," she said quietly. "You will wear the bronze silk." Lady Margaret's tone made it clear this was not a discussion. The bronze silk was 4 years old, unfashionable, and the color of autumn leaves about to fall. It would render Josephine approximately as visible as the wallpaper, which was, of course, precisely the point. I want to pause here and tell you something about what it does to a person to be systematically erased. Josephine was not stupid. She was, in fact, remarkably intelligent, a voracious reader, a keen observer, a woman whose quiet exterior concealed a mind that never stopped working. But intelligence in 1843 was not a quality valued in women. It was tolerated at best, feared at worst, and in Josephine's case, simply ignored. What Lady Margaret had done, the deliberate campaign of neglect, the careful erasure of her eldest daughter's presence from every social occasion, the relentless message that Josephine was not worth the investment, had not broken Josephine. It had done something more insidious. It had convinced her that her mother was right. The Duchess of Pembroke's ball was held on the first Saturday in October, in a mansion on Grosvenor Square that blazed with candlelight visible 3 streets away. The ballroom was enormous. Gilded ceilings, polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers that scattered light like frozen rain. 250 of London's most powerful families were in attendance. The air smelled of beeswax, French perfume, and the particular tang of competitive ambition that defined every gathering of the season. Josephine stood near the entrance and tried to remember how to breathe. She had been right about the bronze silk. Against the sea of white muslin, pale blue satin, and rose-colored tulle that filled the ballroom, she disappeared. Women moved past her without seeing her. Men looked through her as though she were a pane of glass. She was a ghost at a party she had not been meant to attend, and the absurdity of her presence, after all the months of enforced absence, all the evenings spent alone with Byron, settled on her like a weight. She found a column near the edge of the dance floor, positioned herself behind it with the practiced ease of a woman who had long ago mastered the geometry of invisibility, and watched. This was what she was good at, watching. In 3 seasons of standing against walls and sitting in corners, Josephine had developed an eye for the mechanics of the social world that would have made a spy envious. She could read a marriage negotiation in the tilt of a fan. She could identify a fortune hunter by the way he held his champagne glass, always too tightly, as though afraid someone would take it from him. She could predict which couples would be engaged by Christmas, with an accuracy that bordered on the supernatural. She noted that Lady Ashton's daughter was being steered away from the youngest Cavendish son. Too little money, too much ambition. She noted that the Earl of Stratford's wife had not spoken to her husband all evening, and that the Earl's valet had been seen leaving a milliner's shop in Cheapside, which suggested a mistress whose tastes exceeded the Earl's discretion. She noted all of this, catalogued it, filed it away in the vast library of human behavior she carried in her mind, and told herself this was enough. That watching was enough. That a life observed was still a life lived. Rosalind was dancing her 3rd dance of the evening, her golden hair catching the candlelight, her laughter rising above the string quartet like birdsong designed to attract the most valuable mate in the room. Arabella was at the harp, drawing a small crowd with a piece by Handel that she played with more technical skill than feeling. Lady Margaret was circulating, her smile fixed, her eyes calculating the cost of each interaction the way a moneylender calculates interest. No one looked at Josephine. No one ever looked at Josephine. And then the room changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a ripple of whispered conversation that spread through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Josephine felt it before she understood it. She looked toward the entrance and saw him. He stood in the doorway as though he owned it, which, given his wealth and title, he very nearly did. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with those winter storm eyes that swept the room with the controlled precision of a man conducting a military assessment. He wore black coat, black waistcoat, white cravat tied with a kind of severe elegance that spoke of old money and older discipline. He was not smiling. He was not performing. He was simply present. And his presence rearranged every calculation in the room. "That is the Duke of Blackmore," whispered a woman standing near Josephine's column, her fan moving rapidly. 38,000 a year. Unmarried. They say he has refused every woman in England. "Perhaps he prefers men," her companion whispered back. "He does not. He simply prefers no one." Josephine watched him the way she watched everyone, from the safety of invisibility, with the sharp, hungry eyes of someone who had spent her life on the outside looking in. She watched him greet the Duchess, with a bow that was correct, but not warm. She watched him decline a glass of champagne. She watched him scan the room with those gray eyes, passing over one beautiful face after another, without pausing, without interest, without. He stopped. He was looking at her, not near her, not past her, not through her, at her, directly, unmistakably, with an intensity that made the candlelight seem to dim around them. Josephine's heart stopped. Then it restarted with a violence that made her grip the column. She looked behind her, certain he must be watching someone else. There was no one there. Just the wall and a painting of a hunting scene, and the absolute impossibility of a duke looking at a woman in a bronze silk dress. When she looked back, he was walking toward her. The crowd parted for him without being asked, the way the sea must have parted for Moses, instinctively, inevitably, because some forces were simply too large to resist. He walked with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never been denied anything, and his eyes never left her face. He stopped in front of her. This close, she could smell him, sandalwood and leather and something darker, something that made her think of libraries at midnight and the smoke from a fire that had been burning for hours. "You are standing behind a column," he said. It was not what she had expected. It was not what anyone would have expected. The most powerful duke in England, looking at the most invisible woman in the room, and his opening words were an observation about architecture. "I am," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "It is a very fine column." Something shifted in his eyes. Not a smile. She sensed that smiles were rare from this man, and therefore precious, but a flicker of something that looked dangerously close to interest. "It is an adequate column. You, however, are misusing it." "Am I?" Columns are meant to support ceilings, not to hide women who should be dancing. Josephine felt the blood rise in her cheeks. "I was not hiding, Your Grace. I was observing." "And what have you observed?" She should have demurred. She should have blushed and stammered and said something modest and forgettable, the way she had been trained to do. Instead, because something about his eyes made her feel as though the truth was the only currency he would accept, she said, "that the woman in green by the window is about to discover her husband is dancing with his mistress. That the gentleman in the blue waistcoat has been diluting his wine with laudanum since he arrived. And that you, Your Grace, are the first person to speak to me this evening." The silence that followed was extraordinary. She watched his face, watched the way his jaw tightened, the way those gray eyes narrowed, the way something dark and hot flickered behind his carefully maintained composure. "Dance with me," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "Dance with me. Your Grace, I—" That was not a request, Miss Ashford. The ballroom seemed to contract around them. 250 pairs of eyes swiveled as the Duke of Blackmore, who had refused every woman in England, who had not danced at a public event in 4 years, led a woman in a bronze silk dress onto the floor. I need to pause here and explain why this moment mattered. When a duke asked a woman to dance, it was a statement. When this duke asked this woman to dance, it was a declaration. The entire room understood that something unprecedented was occurring. Mothers gripped their daughters' arms. Rivals exchanged glances of disbelief. Lady Margaret, across the room, went pale enough that her rouge stood out like wounds. The waltz began. His hand settled at her waist, firm, warm, absolute. She placed her hand on his shoulder and felt the heat of him through layers of wool and linen, and the careful distance she had maintained between herself and the rest of the world for 25 years began to collapse. "You know my name," she said. I did not introduce myself. I know a great deal about you, Miss Ashford. That is either flattering or alarming. It is both. He turned her through the steps with an ease that suggested dancing was something his body did without consulting his mind. You are 25. You have attended one season and received no offers. Your mother describes you as plain and of delicate health. You are neither. Josephine missed a step. He caught her effortlessly, his hand tightening at her waist, and continued as though nothing had happened. Who told you these things? Does it matter? It matters to me. He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw something in his eyes that she could not categorize. It was not the cold assessment she had expected. It was not the polite disinterest she had received from every other man who had ever glanced her way. It was hunger. Controlled, disciplined, leashed, but unmistakably hunger. You observed 3 things about this room in the space of a minute, he said. You spoke them with the precision of a woman who has spent years watching the world from the outside. You wore a dress designed to make you invisible and stood behind a column to complete the effect. And yet when I looked at you, Miss Ashford, when I looked at you from across this room, you were the only thing I could see. The music swelled around them. Her heart hammered against her ribs like something caged. Why, she whispered. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he pulled her fractionally closer. Close enough that she could feel his breath against her temple. Close enough that the warmth of his body penetrated the thin bronze silk. Close enough that the scent of him, sandalwood, leather, smoke, became the only thing she could smell. Because I have spent 14 years looking for someone real, he said. And you are the first woman who has not tried to be anything other than what she is. The waltz ended. He released her slowly, as though letting go required more effort than holding on. He bowed, a proper bow, deep and deliberate, the kind a duke gives to an equal. I will call on you tomorrow, he said. It was not a question. The carriage ride home was a masterwork of barely suppressed hysteria. Lady Margaret sat rigid. Rosalind unusually silent. Arabella wide-eyed with delighted horror. Josephine sat in the corner with her hands in her lap, still warm from where his glove had held them. What did you do? Lady Margaret's voice was ice. What could you possibly have done to attract his attention? I stood behind a column, mother. Do not be impertinent. The Duke of Blackmore does not dance with women who stand behind columns. He does not dance with anyone. What did you say to him? The truth. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. I see. And what truth would that be? That no one had spoken to me all evening. The silence in the carriage was worse than shouting. Josephine watched her mother's face cycle through fury, calculation, and something that might have been shame, though it passed too quickly to be certain. He said he would call tomorrow, Rosalind said, her voice brittle. On her. Lady Margaret looked at her eldest daughter as though seeing her for the first time and finding the view deeply unsatisfying. Then we must prepare. Rosalind Arabella, you will be dressed and positioned in the drawing room by 10 o'clock. If the Duke of Blackmore enters this house, he will see all 3 of my daughters, not merely the one who happened to lurk behind a column. He did not ask to see all 3, mother, Josephine said quietly. You will not speak unless spoken to, Lady Margaret said. And you will wear something other than that bronze silk if I have to sew it myself. He arrived at exactly 11 o'clock. The Ashford household had been in hysteria since dawn. Flowers purchased. Drawing room rearranged. Rosalind and Arabella positioned with strategic care near the best light. Josephine sat on the settee in the same bronze silk, because Lady Margaret's threat to sew something new had dissolved in the face of the family's financial reality. His eyes found her immediately. He greeted her parents with minimum courtesy, nodded to her sisters with the disinterest of a man acknowledging furniture, and turned to Josephine. Miss Ashford, would you walk with me in the garden? The garden was a modest square of green behind the townhouse. A few rose bushes past their bloom, a stone bench, a gravel path that took approximately 40 seconds to traverse. But for 20 minutes, it became the entire world. They walked. They talked. Or rather, she talked, because he asked her questions with the relentless precision of a man who wanted to know everything and would accept nothing less than the truth. What do you read? Everything. Byron, Shelley, Keats. Mary Wollstonecraft, though my mother would be horrified to know it. Wollstonecraft. The faintest ghost of something that might have been approval. What else? History. Natural philosophy. The newspapers, when I can find them before they are used to light the fires. Your mother lights fires with newspapers? My mother believes that women who read newspapers become disagreeable. And are you disagreeable? Profoundly. There it was. A crack in his armor. Not a smile, but the suggestion of one. The way a hairline fracture suggests the structural failure to come. Good, he said. I find agreeable women tedious. Now it is important to understand what was happening here. In 1843, a morning call from a gentleman lasted 15 to 20 minutes, was conducted in the presence of family, and involved conversation, so bland it could have been used to treat insomnia. A private walk in a garden, even a garden the size of a pocket handkerchief, was something else entirely. It was intimate. It was deliberate. And when the gentleman in question was a duke with £38,000 a year, it was a statement that reverberated through the drawing rooms of London like a cannon shot. By the time Sebastian Thorne left Curzon Street that morning, 3 things had happened. First, Lady Margaret had begun recalculating her eldest daughter's value with the frantic energy of a banker during a market crash. Second, Rosalind had retired to her room with a headache that was, in truth, a temper tantrum of seismic proportions. And third, Josephine had felt something she had not felt in years, possibly had never felt, stir beneath the careful layers of resignation she had wrapped around her heart. Hope. She hated it immediately. Hope was dangerous. Hope was the crack in the wall that let the cold in. Hope was the reason women like her spent their lives standing behind columns, because they had once hoped for something better and been punished for the presumption. But his eyes, his voice, the way he had said good when she told him she was disagreeable, as though her sharpness was not a flaw to be corrected, but a quality to be treasured. She sat in the garden after he left, on the stone bench with Byron in her lap and the ghost of his cologne still hanging in the air, and she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to want something. The courtship that followed defied every convention Lady Margaret had spent her life mastering, and it drove her to the edge of madness. The Duke of Blackmore called on Josephine 3 times that week. Each visit followed the same pattern. His carriage would arrive at precisely the appointed hour. He would greet the household with the minimum courtesy required, and then he would turn to Josephine with an expression that suggested the rest of the world was merely scenery. He took her driving in Hyde Park on the second day, in a cockle so fine that passers-by stopped to stare. The afternoon was cool, the Serpentine glittering beneath a sky the color of pewter, and Josephine sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her heart performing acrobatics that would have put a circus performer to shame. "You are nervous," he observed, guiding the horses with the effortless control of a man who dominated everything he touched. "I am sitting in an open carriage in Hyde Park with the most talked-about man in England." Nervous is an understatement. Would you prefer a closed carriage? I would prefer that all of London were not currently watching us through their opera glasses. Let them watch. His voice dropped half a register. I want them to. He sent flowers. Not the polite arrangements of courtship convention, but specific flowers. Violets, because she had mentioned they grew wild near the Kent estate and she missed them. Honeysuckle, because she had described its scent as the smell of childhood. Jasmine, after their conversation about the conservatory at the Pembroke ball. Each bouquet arrived with a card bearing a single line of poetry, written in his own hand. She kept every card. She pressed every flower. She told herself this was dangerous, that hope was a luxury she could not afford, that men like Sebastian Thorne did not truly want women like Josephine Ashford, that this was a dream she would eventually wake from with bruises. But each morning the flowers came. And each afternoon, so did he. Lady Margaret watched this campaign with the calculating fury of a general whose battle plan has been rendered obsolete. She attempted to insert Rosalind into every interaction, positioning her golden-haired daughter in strategic locations throughout the house, ensuring she appeared in doorways at precise moments, manufacturing opportunities for Rosalind to display her accomplishments. The Duke treated these insertions with the same polite indifference he had shown from the beginning. He spoke to Rosalind when protocol demanded it, and looked at Josephine when it did not, which was always. Once, when Rosalind positioned herself at the pianoforte and launched into a Mozart sonata timed to coincide with his arrival, Sebastian simply closed the drawing room door, muffling the music, and continued his conversation with Josephine about the merits of Shelley versus Keats, as though nothing had happened. The humiliation was exquisite. "You will need new gowns," Lady Margaret announced one evening, her voice carrying the brittle brightness of a woman who has decided to take credit for a victory she did everything in her power to prevent. "And your hair, we shall try a different arrangement. Something softer, perhaps. And you must practice smiling. Mother, he seems to like me as I am. Men do not know what they like. That is what mothers are for." Can I just say, this next scene is why I love writing these stories. Because what happened next was the moment everything shifted. The almost kiss happened in the music room at Lady Harrington's evening gathering. A small, intimate room with a pianoforte, walls lined with sheet music, and windows that overlooked a garden lit by paper lanterns. They had escaped the main drawing room separately. She first, drawn by the promise of solitude, and he 5 minutes later, with the deliberate patience of a man who had been calculating her movements all evening without once appearing to glance in her direction. She was examining the sheet music on the pianoforte, a piece by Chopin she had never seen before, when she heard his footsteps on the polished floor. Heavy, measured, unhurried. The footsteps of a man who never rushed because the world rearranged itself to meet him on his schedule. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She had learned to identify his presence the way sailors identify a change in wind, by the shift in pressure, the alteration of the air, the way the space behind her seemed to contract and heat as though his proximity had its own gravitational field. "You left the drawing room," he said. "So did you. I followed you. I know." He moved closer. She could feel the heat of him at her back. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that a deep breath would have bridged the distance. The music room and the darkness beyond the windows created a world that felt separate from the one they had left behind. Josephine. Her name. Not Miss Ashford. Her name, spoken for the first time, and the sound of it in his voice, low, rough, stripped of every pretense, made her close her eyes. "Yes. Look at me." She turned. He was closer than she had realized. Close enough that she could see the individual threads of silver in his gray eyes. Close enough that she could count the pulse in his throat. Close enough that when he raised his hand and touched her cheek, just his fingertips, just the lightest contact, she felt it in the marrow of her bones. "I have waited a very long time," he said, "for someone I did not have to pretend with. And you chose the woman behind the column? I chose the only real person in the room." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His eyes dropped to her mouth. The space between them compressed to nothing. Heat and breath and the thundering of her heart. The music room door opened. Rosalind's voice rang out like a bell designed to shatter glass. "Josephine, Mother is asking for you. It is most urgent." Sebastian's hand fell. His jaw tightened. He stepped back with the controlled precision of a man who was exercising every ounce of his considerable discipline, and Josephine felt the distance between them like a physical wound. The urgency, of course, was imaginary. Lady Margaret had not asked for anyone. Rosalind had come hunting, and she had found exactly what she had feared. Her plain sister standing too close to the most powerful man in England, with his hand on her face and something in his eyes that Rosalind had never once seen directed at herself. It happened because of what Rosalind did next. Let me tell you what Rosalind Ashford did, and I promise you, it is going to make you furious. She went to Mrs. Whitfield. Not to her mother, who would have been the conventional choice for family sabotage, but to the matchmaker herself. The one person who understood the machinery behind the Duke of Blackmore's sudden interest in a woman's society had forgotten existed. But Rosalind was not stupid. She understood that the Duke of Blackmore was not a man who acted on gossip. Rumors would not move him. Tears would not persuade him. He was a man of evidence, of precision, of facts verified before judgments were made. So Rosalind provided evidence. She had spent a week studying her sister's handwriting. She had practiced until she could produce a passable imitation, not perfect, but close enough to survive a first glance. And she had written a letter addressed to my dearest S, in what appeared to be Josephine's hand, detailing the terms of a secret arrangement. How Josephine had learned of the Duke's search through a servant's gossip. How she had engineered her invitation to the ball. How the entire courtship was a calculated performance designed to secure his fortune. I found this in my sister's writing desk, Rosalind told Mrs. Whitfield, with tears that were precisely as convincing as they needed to be. I did not want to believe it, but I cannot stand by while a good man is deceived. Mrs. Whitfield examined the letter. The handwriting was close enough to raise alarm. The details, the matchmaker's involvement, the ball invitation, were accurate because Rosalind had deduced them from observation. And the letter's tone was damningly specific, suggesting an intimacy with the Duke's private arrangements that an innocent woman should not possess. The note arrived at the Duke's London residence that evening. Mrs. Whitfield requesting an urgent meeting regarding matters of integrity concerning a certain arrangement. She brought the letter. What followed were 9 of the worst days of Josephine's life. And though she did not know it, 9 of the worst days of Sebastian's. He did not simply disappear in wounded silence. That was not in his nature. The letter troubled him. Not because he believed it immediately, but because it contained details about his arrangement with Mrs. Whitfield that no outsider should have known. The handwriting was similar enough to the brief notes Josephine had sent in response to his flowers that he could not dismiss it outright. And the cold, analytical part of his mind, the part that had protected him from 14 years of fortune hunters and social climbers, whispered that this would not be the first time a seemingly genuine woman had turned out to be performing. So he investigated. He sent his man of business to trace the paper the letter was written on. He had his secretary compare the handwriting against Josephine's genuine correspondence, the brief, warm notes she had sent thanking him for the flowers. He visited Mrs. Whitfield 3 times, questioning every detail. And with each day that passed, the evidence grew murkier rather than clearer. Because Rosalind's forgery was good enough to resist casual scrutiny, but not good enough to survive sustained examination. On the 5th day, his secretary identified 3 discrepancies in letter formation. The way the forger crossed her T's, the slant of her capital J, the pressure of certain downstrokes. The handwriting was similar, but not identical. Someone had copied Josephine's hand. On the 7th day, his man of business traced the paper to a stationer on Bond Street, the same stationer where Rosalind Ashford had recently purchased writing supplies. On the 9th day, Josephine's letter arrived. And the moment he placed it beside the forged document, the truth was undeniable. The handwriting was different. Not dramatically, but unmistakably, to a man who had spent 9 days memorizing every curve and stroke of both. The letter Rosalind had forged was a performance. Josephine's letter was real. He could see it in every line, the slight tremor of the quill, the places where ink had pooled because her hand had paused, the raw, unguarded honesty of a woman who had nothing left to perform. Meanwhile, Josephine knew none of this. She knew only the silence. Sebastian disappeared. No calls. No flowers. No cards bearing lines of poetry. The silence was total, sudden, and devastating. A void that swallowed the fragile hope she had allowed herself to feel and replaced it with a familiar, suffocating certainty that she had been a fool. The first day, she told herself there was an explanation. A matter of business. An obligation at one of his estates. Something rational. Something logical. Something that had nothing to do with her. The second day, doubt crept in, cold and insidious, like fog through a cracked window. The third day, she stopped eating breakfast. By the 5th day, she had reread every card he had sent, every line of poetry, every pressed flower, and begun the agonizing process of trying to remember if she had done something wrong. Had she been too forward? Too sharp? Too plain? Too strange? too much or not enough of something she could not identify. By the 7th day, she had stopped asking what she had done wrong and started accepting what she had always known, that women like her were not chosen. Not permanently. Not by men like him. She had been a curiosity. A novelty that had amused a bored duke for a few weeks before he returned to his senses and remembered that he could have anyone. Josephine sat in the upstairs drawing room and waited. And when the waiting became unbearable, she read. And when the reading lost its power to distract, she sat in the garden on the stone bench where they had first walked together and pressed her palms against the cold stone until the sensation grounded her. Lady Margaret's satisfaction was barely concealed. "I told you," she said not to Josephine directly, but within earshot to Sir Thomas, "that it would not last. Men like that do not marry women like her." Rosalind's triumph was luminous. Arabella watched her eldest sister with the guilty discomfort of someone who understands that an injustice is being committed but lacks the courage to intervene. On the 9th day, Josephine wrote a letter. She did not know if he would read it. She did not know if it would reach him. She did not know if the silence of the past 9 days meant he had discovered whatever truth Rosalind had poisoned him with, or if he had simply tired of the novelty of a plain woman who read too much and talked too little. She wrote it anyway. In the early hours of the morning, by candlelight, with the stub of a quill, and ink she had to warm over the candle flame because it had thickened with cold. Her hand shook. The words came slowly at first, then faster, then in a rush that felt less like writing and more like bleeding. She wrote the truth. That she did not understand his silence. That she had no hidden agenda, no secret correspondence, no cunning plan. That she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who read too much, talked too little, and had been foolish enough to hope that someone might want her the way she was. She wrote that she had spent 3 seasons learning to expect nothing, and that his attention had been the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her, because it had given her something to lose. She ended with, "If you have decided I am not what you wanted, I will accept that. But I deserve to be told, Your Grace. Not simply erased. I have been erased enough." She sealed the letter with candle wax, gave it to the one servant in the household she trusted, Mary, the kitchen maid who had shown Josephine small kindnesses over the years when Lady Margaret was not watching, and returned to her room to wait for an answer she was not certain would come. The letter arrived at Blackmore House at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Sebastian read it standing in his study by the window, holding the single sheet of paper with hands that were not entirely steady. He read it once, quickly. Then again, slowly. Then a third time with his eyes closed, as though committing each word to memory, or perhaps to punishment. The phrase, "I have been erased enough," broke something in him that 9 days of cold calculation had not been able to touch. He arrived at Curzon Street before dawn the next morning. He did not knock. He did not wait for the footman. He strode into the house as though he owned it, which, given his financial power, he very nearly could have. And he stood in the entrance hall in his riding boots and his traveling coat, with rain in his hair and something wild in his eyes, and said to the startled housekeeper, "Where is she?" Josephine was in the upstairs drawing room. She had not slept. She was wearing a shawl over her nightgown, reading by a single candle that had burned down to a stub. And when the door opened and he filled the frame, wild-eyed, cravat undone, looking as though he had ridden through the night, because he had, she stood so quickly that her book fell to the floor. "Your letter," he said. His voice was rough, cracked at the edges, nothing like the controlled instrument she had grown accustomed to. "Your letter said you had been erased enough. I have." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He took her hands, both of them, bare, unloved, his fingers closing around hers with a pressure that was just short of desperate. "I will never erase you," he said. "Do you understand? Never. I was given a forged letter in what appeared to be your handwriting, claiming the courtship was a manipulation. I did not believe it, but I could not dismiss it without proof, because the forgery was good enough to demand investigation. I have spent 9 days dismantling that lie piece by piece. And I should have told you. I should have come to you and asked you directly. And instead I retreated into investigation, because investigation felt safer than trust. And I am sorry. A forged letter. In my handwriting. The color drained from her face. Who would? She stopped. She knew. Your sister, he said. She forged the letter and brought it to Mrs. Whitfield. My secretary confirmed the handwriting discrepancies on the 5th day. My man of business traced the paper to a stationer where your sister had recently purchased supplies. And then your letter arrived. And the moment I placed it beside the forgery, the truth was undeniable. He lifted her hand, pressed it against his chest where his heart was hammering. Your handwriting is alive, Josephine. It trembles and pauses and pools in the places where your heart was breaking. No one could forge that. Josephine's face went very still, the kind of stillness that precedes earthquakes. You investigated a forged letter for 9 days, she said slowly, and did not once think to show it to me. The woman whose handwriting it supposedly was. The woman who could have identified the forgery in 5 seconds. You retreated into evidence and analysis and control because those things are safe and trust is not. She pulled her hands from his. I understand that, Sebastian. I understand it because I do the same thing. I retreat into observation, into watching, because watching is safer than participating. But you cannot build a marriage on investigation. You cannot love someone from a distance and call it devotion. At some point, you have to trust me. Even when the evidence is unclear. Even when your instincts tell you to withdraw. You have to choose me over your fear. The silence that followed stretched like a wire between them. She looked at him, this man, this impossible, infuriating, devastating man, standing in her drawing room at dawn with rain in his hair and his composure in ruins. And she felt 2 things at once. A relief so vast it threatened to drown her, and a fury so hot it could have lit the candles. 9 days, she said. Her voice was quiet. It was the quietness of a blade being drawn. You gave me 9 days of silence. Do you know what I did with those 9 days, Your Grace? I convinced myself again that I was not worth choosing. I sat in this room and I dismantled every good thing you made me feel, piece by piece, because that is what I have been trained to do. My mother taught me that. And your silence confirmed it. His face changed. Not the cold mask. Something worse. Pain, naked and undefended, in a man who had spent his life ensuring no one ever saw him vulnerable. That was cruel, she said. Not the investigation. The silence. You owed me the truth. Even an incomplete truth. Even an uncertain one. I know. His voice was barely above a whisper. And I will spend however long it takes proving that it will never happen again. If you want me, Sebastian Thorne, you will have to earn me. Not with flowers and poetry. Not with carriages and gowns. You will have to trust me even when it is terrifying. Because I will not love a man who only sees me when it is convenient. You are right, he said. About all of it. I know I am. I will earn you. You may begin immediately. And for the first time since she had met him, the Duke of Blackmore smiled. Not the ghost of a smile. Not the suggestion of one, but a real, full, devastating smile that transformed his face from something carved and cold into something achingly, vulnerably human. There she is, he said softly. The woman behind the column. I was afraid she might have disappeared. She does not disappear, Josephine said. She was simply waiting to see if you would come back. I will always come back. Prove it. The days that followed were different. Sebastian did not simply resume the courtship where it had left off. He rebuilt it from the foundation, piece by piece, with a transparency that bordered on the uncomfortable. He told her about the investigation, every detail, the handwriting analysis, the paper trail, the moment he had placed her letter beside the forgery and seen the truth. He showed her Rosalind's forged letter, let her examine it herself, watched as her face went through the same cycle of recognition and fury that his had. It is good, she said, her voice tight. She practiced. For a week, according to the servants I questioned. You questioned the servants. I questioned everyone. She looked at him. You really cannot help yourself, can you? Investigation is your first language. It is the only language I trusted for a very long time. He took the forged letter from her hands, folded it carefully, placed it in his pocket. But I am learning a new one, slowly, with a very patient teacher. I am not patient. No. But you are honest. And that is more valuable. He told her about his childhood, about a father who had taught him that people lie as naturally as they breathe, and that the only way to survive was to verify everything, trust nothing, and keep your vulnerabilities locked behind walls so thick that no one could exploit them. He was not wrong, Sebastian said. They were walking in Hyde Park, the autumn air crisp, the leaves turning gold and red around them. People do lie. I have spent 14 years proving his theory correct. And yet you are here, with me, the worst liar in London. You are not the worst liar. You are the most honest person I have ever met. There is a difference. Is there? I still try to lie, Sebastian. I am simply terrible at it. Exactly. He stopped walking, turned to face her. You try to lie, and your face betrays you. Your voice betrays you. Your entire body refuses to cooperate with the deception. Do you know what that means? That I am constitutionally incapable of playing cards? That I will always know where I stand with you? That when you say you care for me, I will see it in your eyes before the words leave your mouth? That when you are angry with me, I will not have to guess? That when you are afraid or hurt or happy, I will know? Not because you tell me, but because you cannot hide it. He took her hands. Right there, in the middle of Hyde Park, with half of London watching. My father taught me that trust was weakness. That vulnerability was a target. That the only way to survive was to keep everyone at a distance and verify their motives before allowing them close. And he was right. For the world he lived in, he was absolutely right. But that is not the world I want to live in anymore. What world do you want? One where I trust you, even when it terrifies me. Even when every instinct I have tells me to investigate first and feel later. One where your terrible lies are the most honest thing I have ever heard. Josephine felt her eyes burn. You are getting better at this. At what? Trusting. I have an excellent teacher. 3 days later, he took her to the Royal Society. Not to a public lecture, but to a private tour of the collections, fossils, mineral specimens, scientific instruments that gleamed like jewelry in the afternoon light. He had arranged it through a friend, called in a favor, because she had mentioned once, just once in passing, that she had always wanted to see the Society's collection, but women were not permitted entry. You arranged this for me, she said, standing in front of a case containing specimens from the South Seas. How? I ask. The Royal Society does not allow women. They allow the guests of peers. And you are my guest. She turned to look at him. You are breaking rules for me. I am changing my world to fit you in it. There is a difference. That night, Josephine sat in her room with Rosalind's forged letter, which Sebastian had given her to do with as she pleased. She could have burned it. She could have confronted Rosalind with it. She could have shown it to her parents and watched her sister's world collapse. Instead, she folded it carefully, placed it in her writing desk, and locked it away. Not as evidence, not as ammunition, but as a reminder that she had been erased before and survived, that she had been lied about and emerged with the truth, that the people who should have loved her had tried to destroy her, and she had found someone who chose to build her up instead. The letter was proof. Not of Rosalind's cruelty, but of Josephine's resilience. And she would keep it locked away in the dark, where it could not hurt anyone anymore. The reckoning with Rosalind came 3 days later, and it was not Josephine who initiated it. It was Sebastian. He arrived at Curzon Street at 10 o'clock in the morning, requested a private audience with the entire Ashford family, and when they were assembled in the drawing room, Sir Thomas bewildered, Lady Margaret calculating, Rosalind pale, Arabella wide-eyed, and Josephine silent. He closed the door. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. And his voice, when he spoke, was the voice that had made hardened politicians reconsider their positions. Miss Rosalind Ashford, he said, you forged a letter in your sister's handwriting and presented it to Mrs. Whitfield as evidence that Miss Josephine Ashford was manipulating me for financial gain. The room went absolutely silent. Rosalind's face drained of color. I don't know what you, Do not insult my intelligence by lying." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folder. "I have the original forged letter. I have a handwriting analysis from my secretary comparing it to your sister's genuine correspondence. I have a receipt from the Bond Street stationer where you purchased the paper. And I have signed statements from 3 servants who witnessed you practicing Miss Josephine's handwriting at your writing desk." He placed the folder on the table between them. "You did this because you were jealous. Because you could not bear the thought that someone wanted your sister instead of you. Because you have spent your entire life being told you were the valuable one, the beautiful one, the one worth investing in. And when I looked past you, as though you did not exist, you decided to destroy the best thing that had ever happened to her." Rosalind's hands were shaking. Tears spilled down her cheeks, real ones this time, born of fear rather than performance. "Your Grace, I made a mistake. I was foolish, I was desperate. You were cruel." His voice cut through her excuses like a knife through silk. "And cruelty, Miss Ashford, has consequences." He turned to Lady Margaret, whose face had gone the color of old parchment. "You, Lady Margaret, created the conditions that made this possible. You took a daughter of extraordinary intelligence and worth, and you convinced her she was worthless. You dressed her in rags and told her she was plain. You erased her from your family, as though she were a stain to be scrubbed out. Not because she was lacking, but because her qualities shamed you. Because her intelligence highlighted your scheming, her honesty exposed your vanity, and her quiet dignity made your ambition look like exactly what it was: desperation dressed up as strategy." Lady Margaret opened her mouth. No sound came out. "You will attend our wedding," Sebastian continued, his tone making it clear this was not a request. "You will smile. You will tell every person who asks that you are proud of your eldest daughter. And you will be convincing, or the distinction will not matter. After the wedding, you will retire to the Kent estate on an allowance of £300 per year. You will not return to London. You will not attend the season. You will live quietly in the country, and you will be grateful for the mercy I am showing you." Now, I want you to understand what this sentence meant. £300 a year was, for a married woman in the countryside, a comfortable existence. It was not the money that constituted the punishment. It was the exile. Lady Margaret's entire identity, her social climbing, her scheming, her relentless campaign to infiltrate the upper reaches of the aristocracy, required London. It required balls, dinners, calling cards, the Mayfair townhouse, the season. Without London, Lady Margaret was nothing. She was a woman in a country house, writing letters that no one of consequence would read, receiving no invitations, attending no events, slowly becoming the very thing she had made Josephine: invisible. "If I hear," Sebastian said, his voice dropping to something quiet and infinitely more dangerous, "that you have spoken a single unkind word about Josephine to anyone ever, for the rest of your natural life, I will reduce that figure to £200. And if you test me further, I will reduce it to nothing, and you will discover what it feels like to be the woman no one wants. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Margaret nodded. She could not speak. She could barely breathe. Sebastian turned to Rosalind. "As for you, Miss Ashford, I have already spoken with Mrs. Whitfield. She has struck your name from her books. No reputable matchmaker in London will represent you. Your forgery has been documented. Your character has been assessed, and the assessment is final." Rosalind made a sound, half sob, half gasp. In the world of the London marriage market, where a matchmaker's endorsement was the currency of marital viability, this was social execution. "Your Grace, please, I am ruined." "You ruined yourself." His voice held no sympathy. "You attempted to ruin your sister, and you failed. Now you will live with the consequences of that failure. Consider it a lesson in the cost of cruelty." He looked at Sir Thomas, who had sat through the entire exchange with the stunned expression of a man watching his world collapse. "Sir Thomas, you have my sympathies. You are a good man married to an ambitious woman, and you have allowed that ambition to dictate the treatment of your daughters. I do not hold you responsible for your wife's choices, but I do hold you responsible for your silence. You watched your eldest daughter be erased, and you said nothing. That is not evil, sir. But it is cowardice. And cowardice has its own price. Sir Thomas bowed his head. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Your Grace, I did not know what to do. I am not a strong man. I never have been. Then learn to be one. Sebastian's voice softened fractionally. Your daughter Josephine is the strongest person in this room. She survived 25 years of systematic erasure and emerged with her integrity intact. If you want to make amends, start by telling her the truth. That you failed her, that you are sorry, and that you will do better. He turned to Josephine, who had not moved, had not spoken, had watched the entire scene unfold with those sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. I need to speak with you, he said. Alone. They walked to the garden. The same modest square of green where they had first talked, where he had asked her about newspapers and disagreeable women, where she had first allowed herself to hope. The morning was cold. Frost glittered on the rose bushes. Their breath formed clouds in the air. You did not need to do that, Josephine said. Yes, I did. I could have handled Rosalind myself. I know you could have. But you should not have to. He took her hands, bare hands in the cold air, and his were warm and solid and steady. You have spent your entire life fighting to be seen, fighting to be valued, fighting to take up space in a world that told you that you did not deserve any. I will not allow you to fight those battles alone anymore. Not your mother, not your sister, not anyone who tries to make you small. Sebastian, I failed you once. I gave you 9 days of silence when I should have given you trust. I will not fail you again. When someone tries to hurt you, I will destroy them. Not because you cannot destroy them yourself, but because you should never have to question whether I am on your side. There should never be a moment, ever, where you wonder if I will choose you. I will always choose you. Josephine felt something crack open in her chest. Something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it was there. My father called me plain when I was 12, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. He did not mean to hurt me. He was simply stating a fact, the way you might observe that the sky is gray or the tea is cold. Josephine is the plain one, he said to my mother. We shall have to be strategic with her. I was standing right there. He did not even notice I had heard him. Sebastian's hands tightened on hers. From that moment on, I understood my value. Or rather, my lack of it. I was the one who would require strategy. The one who could not rely on beauty or charm. The one who would need to be clever, because clever was all I had. And then my mother decided that even clever was not worth the investment, and I became nothing at all. You were never nothing. I know that now. But for a very long time, I believed I was. And then you looked at me across a ballroom, and I thought, just for a moment, that perhaps I had been wrong. That perhaps I was something after all. You are everything. She looked up at him. His face was fierce, his eyes burning with something that looked like rage and devotion, and a dozen other things she could not name. When you disappeared for 9 days, she said, I thought I had been right the first time. That I was nothing. That you had realized it. That the entire courtship had been a mistake you were too polite to correct directly. Josephine. Let me finish. Her voice was steady. I thought that. I believed it. And then I wrote you that letter, and you came back. And you stood in my drawing room at dawn with rain in your hair and your heart on your face. And I understood something I had never understood before. What? That being chosen is not about being perfect. It is about being seen. Really seen. Not the performance. Not the mask. Not the version of yourself you think someone wants. But the real thing. The broken, scared, angry, hopeful, messy thing underneath. And you saw that. You saw me. And you came back. Sebastian pulled her closer. Close enough that she could feel the heat of him through her cloak and his coat. Close enough that his breath ghosted across her temple. I will always come back, he said. Even when you push me away. Even when you are angry. Even when you are scared. Even when every instinct I have tells me to retreat into investigation and control and safety. I will choose you. Over my fear. Over my training. over everything my father taught me about trust and vulnerability and keeping my walls high. I will choose you. Then prove it, she whispered. How? Ask me. He understood immediately. His eyes widened fractionally, and then something settled in his expression. A decision made, a Rubicon crossed. He released her hands, stepped back, and then slowly, deliberately, with the same controlled precision he brought to everything, the Duke of Blackmore lowered himself to one knee in the frost-covered garden. Josephine Ashford, he said, and his voice was steady despite the fact that his heart was hammering so hard she could see his pulse in his throat. I have searched for you for 4 years. I rejected every perfect woman in England because perfection bored me, and you, standing behind a column in a bronze silk dress, watching the world with the sharpest eyes I have ever encountered, were the opposite of perfect. You were real. He took her hand. His fingers were cold from the frost, but his grip was warm, solid, unshakable. You are not beautiful in the way society understands a word. You are better. You are interesting. You are intelligent. You are honest to the point of brutality. And you observe the world with a precision that makes me feel seen in a way I have never been seen before. You make me want to be better than I am, braver than I am, more honest than I have ever allowed myself to be. His thumb traced circles on her palm. I failed you once. I will spend the rest of my life ensuring I never fail you again. Marry me. Let me prove that trust is not weakness. Let me prove that choosing you was the sanest thing I have ever done. Let me spend every day for the rest of my life ensuring that you are never invisible again. The garden was silent except for the sound of their breathing and the distant clatter of carriages on Curzon Street. Josephine looked down at him, this impossible man, this duke who had rejected every perfect woman and chosen her, who had knelt in the frost despite every lesson his father had taught him about vulnerability and power and keeping the world at a distance. Yes, she said. The word came out like an exhale, like something she had been holding in her chest for 25 years. Yes. He stood in one fluid movement, pulled her against him, and kissed her. Not the careful, controlled kiss of a man performing for society, but something raw and desperate and real, a kiss that tasted like 4 years of searching and 9 days of silence, and the relief of finally finding home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against hers. I am going to be terrible at this, he said. At what? At trusting. At not investigating every concern. At believing you when you say everything is fine without verifying it 17 different ways. I know. And you still want to marry me? I want to marry you because of it, not despite it. I do not want a perfect man, Sebastian. I want you. Walls and all. Investigation and all. Trust issues and all. As long as you keep trying. As long as you keep choosing me, even when it terrifies you. Always. The engagement was announced in the Times on a Monday morning, in the marriages column, with a brevity that belied its seismic impact. His Grace the Duke of Blackmore is pleased to announce his engagement to Miss Josephine Ashford, eldest daughter of Sir Thomas Ashford of Kent. Society lost its collective mind. The woman no one wanted. The woman who stood behind columns. The woman whose own mother had tried to hide her. Engaged to the most powerful duke in England. The gossip columnists exhausted their supplies of ink. The drawing rooms of Mayfair hummed with speculation, outrage, and the particular fury of mothers who had spent thousands of pounds presenting their own daughters, only to be eclipsed by a woman in a bronze silk dress who had not even been officially presented that season. It is an outrage, declared the Countess of Pemberton, who had spent £900 on her daughter's wardrobe alone. The Ashford girl has no connections, no fortune, no beauty to speak of. What can he possibly see in her? What he saw, of course, was everything the Countess of Pemberton could not. Because the Countess, like the rest of society, had been trained to look at surfaces. And Sebastian Thorne had spent his life looking beneath them. But it was the danger that came next that revealed exactly what kind of man Sebastian was when someone threatened what belonged to him. Mr. Cornelius Wade was a man whose business empire Sebastian had systematically dismantled 3 years prior, after discovering Wade's shipping company was involved in the illegal opium trade. Wade's fortune had evaporated, his reputation destroyed, his social standing reduced to nothing. He blamed the Duke of Blackmore for every misfortune that had befallen him since, a list that grew longer with each bottle of brandy and each creditor who came knocking. When he heard that Blackmore was to marry, he saw not a wedding, but an opportunity to hurt the Duke by hurting the one thing he cared about. It happened on a Thursday evening. Josephine had stepped outside the theater for air, while Sebastian spoke with the Lord Chancellor about a matter of parliamentary reform. The night was cold, the street quiet, the gas lamps casting pools of yellow light on the cobblestones. She stood beneath the portico, breathing in the clean air after the stifling heat of the theater, and she did not hear the footsteps until a hand closed around her arm and yanked her into the shadows between the building and the carriage house. "So you are his weakness," Mr. Wade hissed. His breath reeked of brandy. His grip was bruising. "Plain little thing, aren't you? Hard to believe you're worth all this trouble." "Release me." Her voice was steady. Her heart was not. "Tell your Duke that debts come due. Tell him that some men do not forget, and some men do not forgive." "I said release me." Something in her voice stopped him. Perhaps it was the steadiness of it, the absolute refusal to tremble despite the fear that hammered in her chest like a caged animal. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him, not with the terror he expected, but with the cool, cataloging precision of a woman who had spent her entire life reading people from the safety of corners and shadows. "You are Mr. Cornelius Wade," she said. She had read about his scandal in the newspapers. The same newspapers her mother used to light fires, the ones Josephine rescued each morning before dawn and devoured in the upstairs drawing room while the rest of the house slept. "Your shipping company was involved in the opium trade. The Duke of Blackmore exposed you in 1840. You lost your fortune, your business, your seat on the exchange. You have 3 creditors who will have you arrested by year's end." She met his eyes. "And you are currently assaulting the betrothed of the Duke of Blackmore on a public street. Which of these facts, Mr. Wade, do you imagine will destroy you first?" Wade's grip loosened. Just fractionally. Just enough. And in that moment, Sebastian Thorne materialized from the darkness like something summoned from nightmare. Not running. Walking. But walking with the coiled, lethal purpose of a man who has found the thing he was born to destroy. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply took Mr. Wade by the throat, pressed him against the wall of the theater, and held him there with one hand while the other reached for Josephine. "Are you hurt?" he asked her. His voice was perfectly calm. His hand, the one holding Wade against the wall, was not. "No. I was handling it." The faintest flicker crossed his face. Not amusement, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that said, "Of course you were." "I noticed," he said. "But I will handle the rest." He turned to Wade. "You touched her. Blackmore, You touched her." The words were quiet, precise. Each one a verdict. "I am going to destroy you. Not quickly. Not cleanly. I am going to dismantle your life so thoroughly that your own family will pretend they never knew you. But first." He released Wade's throat. "You are going to kneel. You are going to apologize to her. And you are going to pray that she is more merciful than I am." Wade knelt in the gutter, on the cobblestones, before a woman he had called plain. He knelt and apologized with the desperate sincerity of a man who understands that his life is no longer his own. Josephine looked at Sebastian. His eyes were blazing with a fury so pure it was almost beautiful. She put her hand on his arm, not to restrain him, but to anchor him. "That is enough," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled. "For you," he said, "it is enough. For me, it will never be enough." Within a week, Mr. Cornelius Wade was financially destroyed. Every debt called in. Every asset seized. Every business connection severed with surgical precision. Sebastian did not do this in secret. He did it openly, systematically, with the calm deliberation of a man demonstrating to all of England what happened when you touch something that belonged to him. The message rippled through the drawing rooms of London like a shockwave. The Duke of Blackmore's betrothed was untouchable, and the cost of learning that lesson was absolute ruin. Wade left England on a merchant ship bound for the Americas. He never returned. I have to pause here and tell you, when I wrote this scene, the sheer scale of Sebastian's retribution took my breath away. This was not the hot-blooded rage of a jealous lover. This was the cold, methodical destruction of a man who understood power not as a weapon of impulse, but as an instrument of precision. He did not simply punish Wade. He erased him, the same way the world had tried to erase Josephine. The symmetry was devastating. The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, on the first Saturday in November, in a church so packed with England's most powerful families that latecomers were turned away at the door. Josephine wore ivory silk, simple, elegant, with no adornment but the strand of pearls Sebastian had given her the night before, accompanied by a card that read simply, "Real always." She walked down the aisle with her hand on her father's arm. Sir Thomas, who had never protected her from her mother's cruelty, but who wept openly now, perhaps understanding at last what he had failed to see for 25 years. And at the altar stood Sebastian, not smiling, because smiles were still rare from this man, still precious, but looking at her with those storm-gray eyes that held everything his face would not show. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms and faces and the thousand tiny betrayals of human expression, that this was real. The vows were spoken. The register was signed. And when Sebastian kissed her, a brief, controlled kiss that nevertheless carried the weight of 4 years of searching, the congregation held its collective breath. Because even the most cynical among them could feel the gravity of what they were witnessing. The breakfast was held at Blackmore House, Sebastian's London residence, a palatial mansion on Park Lane that made the Ashford townhouse look like a gardener's cottage. 300 guests. Champagne that cost more per bottle than most families spent in a month. A wedding cake 6 tiers high. Musicians from the Royal Opera. But Josephine barely noticed any of it. She was waiting, because Sebastian had told her the night before, as he fastened the pearls around her neck with hands that trembled slightly, "I have something to show you tomorrow, after the breakfast. Something I built for you. What is it? You will see." And now, as the last guest departed and the servants began clearing the glasses and plates, he took her hand. "Come with me." They walked through corridors lined with portraits of thorns going back 3 centuries, through rooms filled with furniture that cost more than some estates, through a world so vast and so foreign that Josephine felt herself growing smaller with each step. And then Sebastian stopped in front of a door. A simple wooden door in the east wing, unremarkable except for the key he pulled from his pocket, a small brass key, warm from being held in his palm. He placed it in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "This is yours," he said. "Only yours. No one else enters without your permission. Not me. Not the servants. Not anyone." She turned the key in the lock. The door opened, and Josephine stopped breathing. It was a library, but not the formal library of Blackmore House, with its leather-bound sets purchased by the yard for decoration. This was a private library. Her library, built for her. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of warm oak. A bay window overlooking the gardens, with a window seat cushioned in deep burgundy velvet. A desk positioned to catch the morning light. A fireplace already laid with applewood that would scent the room with sweetness when it burned. A reading chair. A lamp with a green glass shade. A writing set with new quills and fresh ink. And on the shelves, every book she had ever mentioned wanting to read. Byron, Shelley, Keats, Wollstonecraft. Scientific papers from the Royal Society. Political pamphlets that polite society considered unsuitable for women. History, philosophy, novels in French and Italian. Every single one. "How did you?" Her voice broke. "How did you know?" "I listened," he said simply. "I listened to every word you ever said, and I remembered." She walked along the shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines. And then she stopped, because there on the center shelf at eye level was a first edition of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, one of only 20 copies known to exist. Sebastian, She turned to look at him. There are only 20 of these in England. I know because I have searched for one myself for 3 years. How long have you had this? He went very still. How long, Sebastian? The silence that followed was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Outside, a bird called in the garden. The fire crackled in the grate. And the Duke of Blackmore stood before his wife with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not control, not composure, not the careful mask of a man who permitted the world to see only what he chose. Something raw, something exposed, something that looked remarkably like fear. For years, he said, the air left her lungs. I first saw you at Lord Harrington's autumn house party. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. The weather was unseasonably warm. You were sitting apart from the others in the conservatory, reading in the dappled light beneath a lemon tree, while the rest of the guests performed their social obligations in the gardens. You were wearing an amber dress, pale almost gold, and you were so absorbed in your book that you did not notice when the wind scattered your pages across the floor. He paused. His voice had gone rough, like stone worn by water. I watched a woman chase paper across a conservatory floor with more passion, more genuine joy, more unguarded life than I had seen from any debutante in a decade of seasons. You were laughing. Your hair had come loose. Your hands were stained with ink. And I thought, she is alive. In a world of performances and pretenses, she is alive. He stopped. She waited. And then you vanished. I turned to ask Lady Harrington who you were, and when I turned back, you were gone. No one could tell me your name. No one remembered a young woman reading alone in the conservatory, because you were the kind of woman people did not remember. I searched for you for 4 years, Josephine. I attended events I despised, scanning every room, every garden, every ballroom for that face. And I never found you, because your mother had already begun hiding you. That party was your second season. After that, you stayed home. The matchmaker, Josephine said slowly. You did not hire her to find just any hidden daughter. You hired her to find me. I hired her to find the woman I had spent 4 years searching for. I did not know your name. I knew only your face, and that you read Byron, and that you were the kind of woman a family might hide. When her inquiries returned your description, gray eyes, angular features, a reader, I asked her to confirm one thing. Whether you read Byron. His voice cracked barely. She confirmed it within the hour. You built this library on faith, she said. Before you even knew my name. You collected these books for a woman you might never have found. Yes. Why did you not simply speak to me at the house party, before I disappeared? His jaw tightened. Because I was afraid. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. Afraid of what? That you would look at me and see the title. That you would perform the way every other woman performs. That the Josephine I had watched from a distance, the real one, the one who read in the sun and chased pages and laughed when she thought no one could hear, would disappear the moment she knew a duke was looking. I needed to see you first. I needed to know that the woman I had imagined for 4 years was real. He paused. And I hesitated too long at that house party. I hesitated, and you vanished, and it took me 4 years to find you again. I will never hesitate again. Josephine felt something break open in her chest. Something that had been locked away. For so long she had forgotten it existed. That was the night she understood the full scope of what had happened. That she had not been chosen on a whim or a fancy, but with the meticulous, obsessive, devastating patience of a man who had spent 4 years building a world for a woman he had not yet spoken to. Every book on those shelves was a love letter. Every title was a year of watching, wanting, waiting. You terrify me, she whispered. He touched her face, his fingertips gentle against her cheek. I know. I don't want you to stop. I never will. She reached behind her to the small table beside the window seat, where she had been reading before the wedding preparations began that morning. The volume of Byron, her volume, the one she had carried from the upstairs drawing room on Curzon Street through every lonely evening of every lonely season. The one whose pages were soft from years of touching, whose spine was cracked in the places she returned to most. She placed it in his hands. "This is the book I was reading the night you sent the invitation," she said. "And the night you disappeared for 9 days. And the night I wrote you that letter. It is the only thing I have ever owned that felt like mine." She closed his fingers around it. "Now it is yours. Because you are the only person who has ever made me feel like I belong somewhere." Sebastian Thorne, the Duke of Blackmore, who had not wept since his mother died when he was 7 years old, who had built his entire existence on the principle that vulnerability was weakness and weakness was death, pressed his forehead against hers. And his eyes were bright, and his breath was unsteady, and he held that book as though it were the most valuable object in England. Which, to him, it was. 6 weeks after the wedding, the calling cards began to arrive. Women who had ignored Josephine for 25 years suddenly discovered her existence. Invitations to teas, dinners, garden parties, and charitable committees poured into Blackmore House with the relentless efficiency of a social tide reversing itself. Now, I want you to understand the irony of this moment. These were the same women who had looked through Josephine at every ball. The same women who had whispered plain and spinster behind their fans. The same women who had counted her among the season's failures and then forgotten she existed. And now they appeared at her door with calling cards and smiles, as though the previous 25 years of silence had been merely an oversight. Josephine handled it with grace, but not with ignorance. She received them in her drawing room, served them tea, engaged them in conversation, and watched them with the same sharp, cataloging eyes that had first caught Sebastian's attention. She knew what they wanted: proximity to power, the Duchess's favor, an invitation to Blackmore House. And she gave it to them selectively, strategically, with a quiet understanding that mercy and justice were not the same thing, and that the greatest revenge was not cruelty, but elevation. At a dinner party hosted by the Duchess of Pembroke, the very woman whose ball had changed everything, Lord Ashcroft made the mistake of quoting Byron at Josephine with the patronizing air of a man explaining literature to a child. "I believe the original line is somewhat different, my lord," Josephine said mildly, and proceeded to correct him with a precision that left the table in stunned silence, and Sebastian watching her with an expression that could only be described as worshipful. "Your wife," Lord Ashcroft said to the Duke afterward, his voice carrying the bewildered respect of a man who has been intellectually outmaneuvered, "is formidable." "My wife," Sebastian replied, "is everything." Rosalind came to Blackmore House once, 3 months after the wedding. She was thinner, paler, and unmarried. Mrs. Whitfield's blacklisting had proven devastatingly effective, and the golden girl, who had once danced 3 dances in a single evening, now found herself struggling to fill a single line on her card. She stood in the entrance hall with her bonnet in her hands and her pride in pieces, and asked to see her sister. Josephine received her in the library. Her library, surrounded by 4 years of books that told the story of a man's obsession. Rosalind looked at the shelves, at the desk positioned to catch the morning light, at the fire crackling in the hearth, and at her sister's face, calm, composed, wearing an expression that Rosalind had never seen on Josephine before. Peace. And something in her expression cracked like ice in spring. "I am sorry," she said. The words came out broken, ragged, nothing like the bell-clear voice that had interrupted the music room moment. "I was jealous. I was cruel. I forged a letter in your handwriting and brought it to Mrs. Whitfield because I could not bear the thought that someone wanted you instead of me. I spent my entire life being told I was the beautiful one, the valuable one, the one worth investing in. And when the Duke of Blackmore looked past me as though I did not exist, I understood for the first time what you must have felt every day of your life." She paused. Her hands were shaking. "And instead of being humbled by that understanding, I tried to destroy the best thing that ever happened to you." She looked at Josephine with eyes red from crying. "I do not deserve your forgiveness." "No," Josephine said quietly. "You do not." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure would hold. Then Josephine poured her sister a cup of tea, and they sat together in the library, in the room built from for years of a man's devotion, and Josephine began slowly, carefully, with the patience she had learned from a man who had waited for years to speak a single word. The work of rebuilding something that should never have been broken. It would take time. It would take honesty. It would take the kind of courage that both sisters, in their different ways, had spent their lives learning to find. Lady Margaret, in her cottage in Kent, received a letter from the Duchess of Blackmore every month. They were brief, factual, signed simply Josephine. They contained no warmth. They contained no malice. They contained instead something far more devastating to a woman like Lady Margaret. They contained indifference. The daughter she had erased had not erased her back. She had simply moved beyond her, into a world so vast and so full that Lady Margaret's cruelty had become, at last, insignificant. And that more than the reduced income, more than the social exile, more than the knowledge that her eldest daughter now outranked every woman she had ever envied, was the punishment that cut deepest. That night, after the guests had departed and the candles burned low, Sebastian found Josephine in her library, curled in the window seat with a volume of Byron. The same edition she had been reading on the night everything changed. He sat beside her. She leaned against him. The fire crackled. The house was quiet. "You asked me once why I wanted the woman no one wanted," he said. "I remember. I did not tell you the truth. Not all of it." She looked up at him. "Then tell me now." He was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything. Title, power, control, until what remained was simply a man, sitting beside the woman he loved, telling the truth. "I was the youngest of 3 brothers. My father was the 4th Duke of Blackmore, and he was a man who understood sons the way a breeder understands horses, in terms of strength, stamina, and suitability for purpose. My eldest brother, William, was the heir. Golden, athletic, everything a duke's son should be. My second brother, James, was the spare. Quieter, but competent, reliable." He paused. His hand found hers in the space between them. "And then there was me. I was small. I was quiet. I preferred books to horses and observation to action. My father looked at me and saw a mistake, a defective product that no amount of training could correct. He told me once, when I was 11 years old, that he was grateful he had 2 other sons because I would have been a disaster as a duke." Josephine's hand tightened on his. He said it at dinner, in front of the entire household, as casually as one might comment on the weather or the quality of the wine. "Sebastian would have been a disaster as a duke. Thank God he will never have to be one." When my brothers died, William of consumption, James in a riding accident, within 2 years of each other, I inherited a title I had never been raised for. And suddenly, the entire world wanted me. Not me. The title. The money. The power. Every woman I met saw the Duke of Blackmore. Every man I spoke to calculated what my friendship was worth. No one saw Sebastian, the boy who read too much, who noticed everything, who had spent his childhood being told he was wrong for being exactly who he was. He looked at her, and his eyes were raw with something she had never seen before. "And then I saw you, sitting alone at a house party, reading Byron, chasing pages in the wind. And I thought, there is a woman the world has overlooked the same way the world overlooked me. There is a woman who knows what it is to be invisible, to be deemed insufficient, to be told she is not worth the effort. If I can find her, if she can see me, then perhaps I am not as alone as I believed." "You are not," she said. Her voice was fierce, certain, carrying the full weight of a woman who had spent 25 years learning to see what others missed. "You were never alone. You were simply waiting for me to stand behind the right column." He laughed, a real laugh, rare and raw and beautiful, and pulled her closer. And the library filled with the warmth of 2 people who had spent their lives being invisible and had at last been seen. "There is something else," he said after a long moment. "Something I have not told you." "What?" "When I first saw you at that house party, you were reading Byron. But I could see the title of the book from where I stood. It was not just any Byron. It was Hours of Idleness, his first published work. The one the critics destroyed. The one he almost stopped writing after because they told him he had no talent. Josephine went very still. You were reading the book everyone told him was not worth writing. The book that almost ended his career before it began. And you were reading it as though it were treasure, as though it mattered. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. That was when I knew, not that you were beautiful or accomplished or socially valuable, but that you saw worth in things the world had discarded, that you believed in voices the world had tried to silence. And I thought, if she can see value in a book the world rejected, perhaps she can see value in a man his own father rejected. Josephine felt tears spill down her cheeks. I would have waited 40 years to find you, Sebastian said. 400 years. However long it took. Because you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen Sebastian instead of Blackmore. The only person who has ever made me feel that I am enough, exactly as I am. She turned in his arms, pressed her forehead against his. You are enough, she whispered. You were always enough. The world was simply too foolish to see it. And you are everything, he said. Everything I searched for. Everything I needed. Everything I will spend the rest of my life ensuring is never invisible again. They sat together in the library, in the room he had built for her before he knew her name, filled with books he had collected on faith, warmed by a fire that would burn as long as they needed it to, and they were finally, completely, utterly home. And that, my friends, is the story of the Duke who rejected 10 perfect brides and demanded the one no one wanted. The story of Josephine Ashford, who spent 25 years being erased by her mother, by society, by a world that could not see past the bronze silk to the extraordinary woman beneath. And of Sebastian Thorne, the Duke of Blackmore, who had watched her for 4 years, collected her books, built her a library, and engineered the most elaborate courtship in the history of the little season, all for a woman the world had thrown away. This story stays with me because it asks a question I think we all carry inside us, whether we admit it or not. What if someone saw the version of me I hide? Not the version I perform for the world. Not the polished, presentable, acceptable version, but the real one, the messy one, the one who reads too much and talks too little, and stands behind columns because it feels safer than standing in the open. What if someone saw that person and said, not change, not be better, not be more, but simply you. It was always you. Remember when I said at the beginning that this story would make you feel things? I hope I delivered. If it did, if your heart ached for Josephine standing behind that column, if it soared when Sebastian walked across the ballroom, if it broke when he gave her that key, and she realized he had been building her a world before she even knew his name, then let me know in the comments. Tell me your favorite moment. Tell me which line stayed with you. Tell me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read every single comment, and knowing you are out there makes every story feel like a conversation between friends. And if you have not subscribed yet, join this community. I would love to have you here for the next story, because I am already working on it. And let me tell you, it might be even more intense than this one. It is about a viscount who inherits his brother's betrothed along with his brother's title. About a woman engaged to one man who finds herself promised to another. About grief and guilt and the terrible, beautiful thing that happens when two people who were never supposed to fall in love discover they cannot help it. But that is a story for another night. Until next time, my friends. Until next time.